All right, welcome everyone. My name is Trevor Polinsky, and this is the cutting edge of cannabinoid science and pharmacology. Our panelists today are Jacob Black, Liz Geiselman, Tyrell Tao, and Kyle Ray. My background, I'm the CEO of Solar Nutraceuticals. We specialize in spagyric extraction, where we separate the salts and oils from the hemp and then recombine them, and our research is showing that we're synthesizing new compounds that we're still learning more about. We have a couple PhD organic and biochemists up here today, so they know much more than I do about this stuff. So we're going to direct the questions towards them and let the experts speak. So let's go ahead and have each of the panelists give a brief introduction, and then we'll get started.
Awesome, thanks. I'm Jake Black, the co-founder at Treehouse, and we recently merged with Next Frontier Brands, where I'm now the chief scientific officer. And Treehouse in particular over the last 5 years has focused on bulk cannabinoid ingredient production, so CBD, tea-free oils, CBG, et cetera, and a lot of research and development. And so my background's in organic chemistry and love to talk science.
All right, my name is Tyrell Toll. I'm Director of Chemistry at MedPharm Holdings. We are a research-focused company here in Denver, Colorado. Actually the first to receive a research license from the state. So we actually, in addition to research, we do sell some products into the recreational medical marketplaces under the brands of Batch, Become, and Alleviar, as well as Awareness. So if you see those out there, you're looking at some good products. So my background is in medicinal natural products chemistry. I got my PhD from the University of Iowa in 2013, and pretty much since then I've been working in cannabis one way or another, whether that's analysis or extraction, purification, or research.
Hi, I'm Liz Geiselman, and I am with 710 Spirits Extraction Products and Rocky Mountain Reagents. I've been in chemical sales for 22 years. We've been in cannabis for about 12. So we do all the chemistry around extraction, post, and we also do all the chemistry for testing. I also serve on the board of the National Cannabis Industry Association, and I serve on their subcommittees for product manufacturing and product safety. I've also served on the CHAMP committee, which I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's the Colorado Hemp Advancement Management Plan as a stakeholder. And then I also represent a collaborative group here called the Canna Consortium, which is a group of us ancillary partners that will take you from plant to product, and they're all vetted and have been in the industry a long time and believe in this industry. They're not going to be these pop-up shops that come in, make an extraction equipment, and then they leave and you're stuck with it. So I'm Liz.
And I'm Kyle Ray. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Colorado Chromatography. My background is primarily in biochemistry and neuroscience. I also spent some time studying different cardiovascular diseases. At Colorado Chromatography, our primary focus is the manufacture of bulk minor cannabinoids, so CBN, CBC, THCV, etc.
Awesome. So first question, what do you guys think as far as any ethical or moral issues with synthesizing minor cannabinoids, any safety concerns, weird solvents, catalysts, precursors being used, concerns for the end consumer about impure product that's going to have contaminants in it? Does any of that worry you, or what is your opinion about how we can do this responsibly in an evolving industry?
I can take a first crack at that, and I'm sure we'll have a bunch of interesting opinions. But yeah, and maybe a step back for the audience that isn't familiar, but the plant is known to make over 100 cannabinoids, and most of those have been unstudied and are kind of called minor cannabinoids. to access most of those molecules in appreciable amounts, you actually have to go through some synthetic intermediates. You have to, take, say, CBD and transform it into a different molecule, and that's how a lot of labs are accessing these minor cannabinoids on bulk scale right now. And so that is synthetic chemistry by definition. When you add chemicals to a mixture to create a new chemical, you are synthesizing it. And one of the big things there is, as a trained organic chemist, that's what I've trained to do. I'm very much okay with it ethically and morally if it's done correctly. And so if it's being done in a controlled lab, in a controlled fashion, in up to all of the pertinent regulations, in particular the FDA has very stringent rules about synthesized molecules. And I am, as of now, not convinced that most or any labs are following kind of FDA best practices when it comes to synthesizing molecules. And so that involves in testing for impurities, identifying any impurities, making sure your synthesis process is fully kind of FDA compliant. And on a day-to-day basis, everyone in this room is consuming a synthesized chemical, whether you know it or not. A lot of vitamins and things on store shelves are synthesized. They're not actually naturally derived. Caffeine, nicotine, those things can all be synthesized as well. And so consuming synthesized molecules is not the big problem. Consuming synthesized molecules that are not made in a safe way is the problem. And because of the lack of oversight and regulation in the industry, I have a large concern that they're not being synthesized properly and they're not going through the correct FDA pathway. And so that's kind of my overview. I'm interested in what everyone else has to say.
And so to kind of tag along on that, what Jake just said, there is no moral, in my opinion, there's no moral wrong in synthesizing cannabinoids inherently. So for example, since many of these cannabinoids, 100 of them even, are found in such minor quantities in the plant, it'll be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to actually extract and purify many of those from the plant directly. So the common approach to advanced research would then be to synthesize those molecules in the lab so that you can do in vitro testing in animals, so on and so forth. It does become a different question when you start talking about something that would be for a consumer, synthesizing on a large scale, something that would be either inhaled or taken orally by an actual medical patient or recreational consumer. It does need to be highly purified, and that can be tricky. It doesn't matter where you source a given molecule, THC, if it's synthetically derived or from the plant, it's the same molecule and will have the same effects. But what is different about them if they're extracted versus synthesized? The answer is the impurities. The impurities are going to be different. We're not very concerned about impurities that come along with plant extracts because people can smoke the whole plant and be just fine. But when you synthesize, you can get byproducts, leftover reagents, things like that really need to be very carefully purified away and then that purity verified.
And from my perspective, I think that's the biggest thing, right? We've had a lot of conversations about this with NCIA, about Delta 8, Delta 10, some of these things that are coming out in the marketplace. It's not about necessarily that they want to squash innovation, because I think that there's a lot of products that are coming out of this market, and the research coming out of this market is going to be pretty changing for a lot of people's lives and health, right? So you don't want to squash innovation. Where I think that we do need to be very careful is making sure that we're producing these products with food-grade chemistry, with pharmaceutical-grade chemistry, making sure you know where that chemistry is coming from, checking your C of A's, making sure that your vendor is qualified and verified, doing quality checks with them. I can't tell you, especially in this market, how many certificates of analysis I've seen that have been forged And so you just want to be careful. I know in my industry, there have been a lot of companies that have come to market that have put that they are a food grade product, and they are not. Their C of A does not qualify it for that. So making sure that you're really working with a vetted source, making sure where you know where your product is coming from, and if you are using bulk chemistry in particular, that you know that it's coming from a designated tank, going into designated lines, going into clean new drums or totes. Because refurbished totes and those types of things are probably the number one reason for some of the residuals that you're going to get, right? So you want to just make sure that you're, watching all of those things and following FDA and trying to be as close to what FDA and USDA and those organizations are going to look at, ASTM. But from that position, I think ethically it would be inappropriate for us not to look at these things, because we can't squash innovation, especially when we're talking about the needs of medical patients that are out there and what the potential of the products coming into market would be.
And just to touch briefly on a topic that the other panelists haven't really addressed at this point is, just in case you're curious, my opinion is that synthesized cannabinoids are totally morally okay, again, as long as you're doing it correctly. However, I think it's an interesting thing to consider is the possibilities of fully synthetic cannabinoids beyond your traditional cannabinoids that are naturally occurring and found in the cannabis plant. There was recently a patent filed for a pain medication that is THC acetate. That is a derivative of THC that is not naturally occurring. It's not found in the plant, but it is thought to be 3 to 5 times more potent than typical THC. So you can see how adding chemical modifications and creating fully synthetic cannabinoids, you can create specific drug targets and you can create specific mechanisms of action that you're after and really create customized medicine for people beyond what nature can produce. However, back to what everyone's been echoing, it is incredibly important, especially if you're talking about fully synthetic cannabinoids, that they are purified properly, that impurity profiles are tested, and that there are no carcinogens or known toxins to humans in those products.
And I just want to jump in here real quickly also. I think the other piece here that we do have to look at from an ethical perspective is as we're creating these new cannabinoids, that we're making sure the consumer really understands what these things are, right? So if it is a hemp-derived, synthetically derived coming from CBD and going to something else, your consumer needs to know that it is no longer CBD, right? So I think that's a big piece here, that the consumer needs to know what, if we're talking about Delta 8, Delta 10, that's not going to be the same as CBD. We're in a very mature market here, so I think a lot of people in Colorado understand, but when you go to places like Indiana or the South, they don't understand the difference between these things. So making sure that those consumers understand what it is that they're going to be consuming is also a part of this.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump in there too, and I think the biggest ethical concern is I think a lot of consumers have no idea, and products are marketed such that you would think they're coming from the plant, oh, this Delta 8, and there's no mention of synthesis or where it came from, and so specifically, and that is, I think, definitely ethically wrong to market it as a naturally plant-derived product when it's definitely undergoing synthesis. And then just a bit of jargon that I wanted to maybe clarify again, because the word synthetic cannabinoid has been in the news a lot in the last certainly 5 years, and there's kind of a class of compounds that are not cannabinoids at all, but they've been deemed synthetic cannabinoids, and that's like the spice and the K2, and there's been really bad toxic horrible effects of those, and so synthetic cannabinoids is what they've been deemed, and so I think a lot of what we're primarily focusing on here as well is cannabinoids that are naturally occurring but are synthesized. And I know that seems like really a fine line to split, but just because synthetic cannabinoids is so different in the news and the mainstream and what the negative effects have been, you just have to be careful that you're talking about the same thing as well.
So it seems like there should be a differentiation in the consumer's mind between an actual synthetic cannabinoid versus a cannabinoid that's found in nature, expressed by the plant, but we're synthesizing in the lab because it's not found in high enough levels to extract and produce a product.
Yeah, and I think, again, it gets really complicated with jargon because you've got hemp-derived cannabinoids that if you just extract the plant, isolate them, and then put them in products. That's kind of one thing. That's what most people think of when they think of cannabinoids. They're coming from the plant, they're being processed a little bit, and then you're putting them in your body. So that's, hemp derived, I would say. Then people will call these synthesized cannabinoids hemp derived because they take CBD from hemp, do chemistry to turn it into something else, and then sell it. And they're like, well, it came from hemp originally, but I would very much say, no, that's a synthesized cannabinoid. And then this synthetic cannabinoid they're not even cannabinoids at all, frankly. They're weird molecules, like very pharmaceutical, that have really potent effects. And they were marketed as cannabinoids and sprayed on like oregano so people could get high really cheaply. And that's like a different class, but that's kind of the complexity that we're dealing with just within this conversation. So
all those reasons, I would argue, everything that's been said here so far, are reasons to purchase your cannabinoids from regulated state marketplaces. The entire hemp marketplace is really in the wild, wild west stages right now. And if somebody's doing chemistry and not doing it well, you'll never know, and you have a kind of a fentanyl spiked in cocaine problem. Like, people are not trying to die from fentanyl consumption, but they're getting a drug off the street that they don't know what's in it. And honestly, a lot of these hemp synthetics are in that realm sometimes. So I would highly encourage you, especially if it's not just straight CBD isolate or straight CBD, if you're interested in these other minor cannabinoids, to get them from the regulated marketplace where there is actually testing and accountability. If something goes wrong, there's a consequence, and those players can be found. So anyway, yeah, just keep that in mind for purchasing.
And this is just kind of unrelated, but related to the regulatory. Like, the FDA, if you go to the grocery store, Safeway, and buy a food product, the vitamin off the shelf, you don't think about any of this. You know that it's been vetted, you trust that it's been vetted by somebody at some point, and it's safe, and there's massive recall and bad publicity and fines if something goes wrong. So you can go to a Safeway and buy anything off the shelf, and you don't worry about it. In this, frankly, the FDA has not regulated the industry at all. And I've been in the industry for 5 years, and that's shocking to me. And we've been asking for regulation, but the only thing they've done is recalled products if they have like grossly mislabeled products or are making health claims like this product will cure cancer. That's the only enforcement they've done to date, and that should be concerning. And I work in the industry, and I'm concerned. And so just so everyone's aware that it's not like going into Safeway at all. And that hurts my business, but it's the truth. So.
Very well put, everyone. Kyle, I'm going to take this back towards you. Our understanding of the endocannabinoid system has evolved immensely in the past decade, from only really understanding the CB1 and CB2 receptors to now looking at the TRPVs and all sorts of other receptors. And we're starting to get a better understanding of how the ECS interacts with the other parts of the central and peripheral nervous system, and it's been referred to as the endocannabinoid dome. Kyle, can you speak to that and how progress has been made in that aspect?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, that terminology he's referring to, the endocannabinoid dome, is the newest phrasing that's being used in the scientific community to describe the endocannabinoidal system. Because again, when you think of the endocannabinoidal system, we primarily think of CB1 receptors, CB2 receptors, where CB1 receptors are what give the cannabinoids their psychoactivity, and CB2 receptors are found all throughout your peripheral nervous system, and that's primarily what CBD is acting on for its anti-inflammatory properties. But if you look more into it, these cannabinoids are actually very promiscuous, and they bind to a number of different receptors throughout the human body. And so one of the biggest drug targets of these cannabinoids is going to be the transient receptor potentials, or the TRP family of receptors. There's 6 subfamilies of the TRP. However, cannabinoids are only known to bind to 3 of them currently, and that's going to be the TRPAs, TRPVs, and the TRPMs. So before I get you guys completely lost in the sauce with all these different acronyms and receptor types, I'll make it brief and keep it simple. So the TRPV families are very important in nociception, or the transfer of pain sensation from your peripheral nervous system to your central nervous system. So there is a good amount of studies being done to the different TRPVs. There's TRPV 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a lot of them. But cannabinoids are found to interact with a good majority of them. And in fact, CBN is one of the big ones that's been shown to interact with the TRPV4. The primary thing that you're going to experience from your TRPAs, that's going to be for calcium-mediated input on your epithelial cells. So that's going to be really important for the development and treatment of different osteopathic ailments such as osteoporosis or osteoarthritis. And then one other family that is currently being included in the endocannabinoidome is the PPAR receptors, or the peroxisome proliferating activated receptors. It's a mouthful. And so these guys are really important in cell differentiation, metabolic processes, and inflammation. So this is going to be a huge field of exploration in the treatment of type 2 diabetes and weight loss in terms of modulating and regulating your metabolism, as well as treatment of chronic inflammation for a variety of different diseases. And so the two primary receptors that you're going to really think about when you think of the PPARs is going to be PPAR alpha and PPAR gamma. Those are primarily what are being interacted with when you think of cannabinoids and endocannabinoids. Yeah, and then...
Does anyone else want to jump in there?
Yeah, so I guess I could add on to that. It's all really good information. One thing that kind of is interesting to me about the endocannabinoidome and actually just kind of cannabinoids in general is that we know that CB1 and CB2 receptors were discovered first as far as the cannabinoid receptors go, but then other receptors and enzymes have been found to play a role. So, for example, CBD doesn't really directly interact with CB1 or CB2 receptors. It's thought to mediate its effects by blocking the metabolism of your endocannabinoids. So it actually interacts with fatty acid amide hydrolase, FAAH, where it inhibits your endocannabinoids from being degraded and then reducing the signal. So it acts kind of indirectly in by keeping your endocannabinoids intact. But it also interacts with the serotonin receptor. So some of its anxiety or antidepressant effects may come from that interaction. So it's a very complicated system. There's definitely the direct receptors, but there's also the metabolism of the endocannabinoids, and then a ton of probably enzymes and maybe even other signaling molecules in our bodies that we just haven't even discovered yet.
To just, I guess, maybe take a kind of historical or step back too is, all that is to say, biochemistry in medicine is very complicated, right? And as far as scientifically speaking, the endocannabinoid system wasn't even really, discovered until mid 90s, early 90s, which scientifically is yesterday. It takes 5 years to publish a single paper, 15 years to get some sort of progress really in any sort of science field, and so there is just so much unknown. We're figuring out more day to day, and interestingly too, because it is such a kind of ubiquitous system, the endocannabinoid system within your body, it appears that's why there is so much potential for these molecules, because it is it's a homeostasis regulator, very involved in inflammation, a lot of cognitive and neural function, and so people are saying, oh, CBD helps me sleep, or CBD helps with pain, or my skin inflammation, or stress, or anxiety, and all of those can kind of be tied down to kind of an inflammation response from the body, whether it's as psychological inflammation, like stress and anxiety, or physical pain, or lesions on your skin. Inflammation is becoming more and more understood, but also it's recognized how important it is, and so the system as a whole. It's going to take a long time to figure all this out, and people are very interested in it. And finally, I think the acceptance of cannabinoids and cannabis and funding from the government and different agencies for research is coming along. But we're still in the very nascent stages of the entire industry, honestly, and it's going to take decades.
Great. That was all great. Thanks, guys. So moving forward, as we look towards innovation in the industry, we're starting to see cannabinoid prodrugs come to market, such as THCO acetate. And the research is suggesting that these acetate forms of cannabinoids are as much as 3 to 5 times more potent than their non-acetylated forms. What do you guys think this means for the industry? If we can take a cannabinoid and make it 5 times more potent, is CBD and THC going to be a thing of the past pretty soon?
Well, I would say that, again, from the perspective of the safety profiles of these different synthetic cannabinoids, I think it's really important to, just touch on what we talked about earlier, to make sure that you're getting, if you are going to go exploring into the prodrug realm, that you're making sure you're getting it from a reputable source that's gone through the right channels and is synthesizing it correctly, checking for impurities, and really making sure that that product is safe for consumption. I would add that there are so many different possibilities that you can do in terms of these prodrugs to these different cannabinoids to change their effects, to enhance the potency, reduce the potency, make it act on a completely different receptor, that it really make your head spin. So I think it's important that as an industry we are open to the idea of creating prodrugs, because again, if you think about it from the perspective of your potential client, the potential patient, the consumer, they want to be able to use the safest, highest quality medication for whatever their ailment is. And sometimes there are ways to improve that medication via chemical modifications. However, it needs to be done safely, it needs to be done correctly. And I do think that these prodrugs are the long-term future of cannabinoids and how they will be taken 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's exactly right. You want to make sure that you're vetting your sources and, in that space. The other reason why I think it's really important to buy your materials from manufacturers coming out of legal states is because they tend to have already SOPs and those types of things that they're working against, right? So as we're starting to talk about how we're going to change these molecules chemically, from my perspective, I get a lot of calls with some pretty crazy chemicals, right? So these are things that aren't usually used in a food substance. They're not usually used in pharmaceuticals, but people in legal states doing this under manufacturing guidelines are going to be looking at those materials and making sure that these things are going to work or they can pull all of that product off. But we're starting to see people experiment with some chemistry that really doesn't exist in a lot of your typical food markets. I think that's why it's important to kind of be in these legal states. Again, I don't want to squash innovation, but some of these chemicals are pretty scary, right? And then not only that, how are they disposing of the chemicals when they're done using them? So you just want to make sure that, that when we're doing the synthesis, we're making sure that the products that we're changing that molecule with are actually safe to do that with. And in the Midwest, and I've seen it in the South, they've used some crazy chemistry to do some crazy stuff, right? But I think it's because they're looking at innovation without the regulation that comes from being in a regulated environment.
Yeah, so this concept of THC prodrugs, that we're making a prodrug from THC or other cannabinoids, is really interesting. Generally, when a pharmaceutical company, for example, is creating a prodrug, they're trying to increase the bioavailability of a poorly bioavailable drug that then will be split into its active drug and the remnants of the prodrug. We're generally not seeking for that prodrug to have its own activity. So this THCO acetate concept is really interesting to me in that we have a prodrug form of THC, which will make it more bioavailable, which would increase its effect on its own. But not only that, but the prodrug itself has increased activity, psychoactivity. So it's kind of a fascinating, not normal pharmaceutical situation, but that's normal for cannabis, I would just say. So I'm kind of interested to see where this goes because, like I said, it's not normal for the prodrug itself to have its own activity, let alone an increased activity at a given receptor. And since the activity we're talking about here is psychoactivity. You know, THCO acetate may not be the best approach to make a pharmaceutical that's more bioavailable to somebody that's not seeking the increased psychoactivity. You know, for example, maybe an Alzheimer's patient doesn't need excessive psychoactivity with their medicine, so maybe another approach for increasing the bioavailability would be better in that situation. But you know, honestly, these synthetics are very interesting. Under normal circumstances in the pharmaceutical industry, they would never, you know, just take even, you know, menthol, change something and give it directly to a human. That would never happen. So it's really interesting how the cannabis industry develops a little bit differently in that way as well. There's a kind of an inherent trust that these cannabinoids will be safe, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. So I would be cautious with new, semi-synthetics or things like that. If you're interested in those, and again, I would stick to the regulated cannabis industry where there is a few more eyes on these things.
Yeah, and mine, again, I hate to be like the Debbie Downer up here. Hopefully that's not me. But yeah, I mean, I also think it's like maybe a double-edged sword. I don't know the right metaphor, but like we saw what happened with the vape crisis, and a couple of years ago, like unregulated products that get out of control, and the the reaction of the FDA or regulators is shut it all down and regulate, and cannabis has made so many strides to be safe and be regulated and get consumer acceptance and awareness that I'm cautious, one of these prodrugs that, it's 10 times more potent than THC, and people are taking it and all sorts of negative side effects come up or whatever, or there's a bad batch and somebody dies, it's gonna set the whole industry back quite a bit. And it's, selfish actors out there who aren't kind of playing by the rules or following the correct guidelines who are gonna, ruin it for everyone. I think there's the potential of that. So I hope it doesn't happen, but it's very easy to see. I mean, they made cannabis illegal for the last 50 years, so they're very okay with making things illegal and shutting it down with the DEA. And if we keep going down this, let's make more and more potent psychoactives, the DEA does not like that. I don't think there's any debate about that the DEA does not like that, and nor are they forgiving. And so that's kind of my cautionary tale of, if it's done correctly, yeah, and if you compare it to pharma, that takes 15 years for them to get a new drug out. Whether that's perfect, no, I think there's a lot of hurdles and bureaucracy, and we've seen with the vaccines recently, you can go faster, but also just making chemicals and selling them into society is a really good way to get everything shut down. So that's kind of my concern.
Yeah, and kind of to touch a little bit on what Jake was saying too, to add on to it, I guess. From a regulator's perspective, the idea of pro-drug psychoactive cannabinoids is a complete nightmare. Because, I mean, if you think about it, making, for example, delta-8 THC or delta-9 THC into a THCO acetate, the one that we've been discussing primarily here, well, by the current definition of the Farm Bill, that is a fully compliant hemp-derived product with less than 0.3% delta-9 THC in it, because it's THCO acetate, not THC. So just something so simple like that can really turn the regulator's job into a complete nightmare. I know a couple of states have moved to make total THC measurable by all of the different isoforms of THC, so delta 7, delta 8, delta 9, delta 10, delta 6A, there's as many as you can name. But people are going to continue to try to find loopholes to create psychoactive cannabinoids that are THC-like or modifications of THC to basically skirt around the rules and try to get you a legal high that the government can't regulate. So it's going to be a continuing battle between regulators and the most cutting edge of the different pro-drugs and different pharmaceutical-esque manufacturing companies to really etch out what it means to have legal cannabinoids derived from hemp, if you can just make chemical modifications to them to tweak them a little bit so they're not THC anymore, or maybe they're not delta-8 anymore, or however you want to look at it. There are a lot of possibilities, and the more complicated it gets, the harder it becomes to regulate.
And I think my concern here, especially in non-legal states in particular, when you can go into a gas station and get delta-8, I think that has the potential to really mess up what's happening in the Farm Bill. And if we do see some things like talked about here, if we start to see children getting hurt, people getting hurt, people dying, it could eventually, it could tear the whole market down, right? Not just hemp, but also marijuana. So we do want to be very cautious, especially in these states that it's not legal, to make sure that these products aren't readily available to children, and especially if they need to know what the product is going to do to them. And it's not just a CBD product. It has been chemically altered to be a different product than CBD. And I think that that's a really hard thing, because if you're a manufacturer, you want it to say CBD because it's legal, right? But if you tell people that it's going to be 10 times more psychoactive than Delta-9, all of a sudden you're going to get into a situation where you can't sell your product on a shelf. So we have to watch that, because this could go one of two ways. We could have great innovation for medicine, or we could tear the whole system down and shut it down and go back to prohibition.
Yeah, and again, kind of DEA is not one to be like, I don't know, if you want to debate with them the intricacies of chemistry and like, well, this is, an isomer here, like they're heavy-handed. They don't really care, and they also like, the Farm Bill has kind of maybe carved a loophole, but the Federal Analogs Act predates that, and I'm more afraid of the DEA, the FDA. They're the ones who will come through your windows, and anybody who's worked in the cannabis industry has heard stories about, I had a grow in my basement, and guys with AR-15s broke through my windows with, like, they don't mess around. And that's not to even say the FDA, because the FDA does have clear rules for synthetic chemicals. You have to prove they're safe and file a new dietary ingredient or generally recognized as safe form, prove you're making it in a safe way, submit all your toxicology data. That all exists. It's very expensive and time consuming, and that's where I think, you don't want to just be kind of the spice industry 2.0 of, we just made a new, different, slightly modified psychoactive substance, because that's kind of what the spice industry did for years. They said, this is bath salts, not for human consumption, and they just kept selling more and more and different, and then people died. And we don't want that to happen in the industry, so.
At what point do you guys think some of these chemically altered cannabinoids are going to start to be considered pharmaceutical compounds and not available for retail purchase? Is there a definition or like a tipping point that designates whether something can be purchased on the shelf or has to, get a prescription?
I think if it's not naturally found in the plant to begin with at this stage, that would be the line for, where it should go under further investigation before being sold to the general public. So, synthesizing a naturally occurring cannabinoid could be acceptable, but synthesizing a non-naturally occurring cannabinoid and then selling that to the marketplace is risky, to put it nicely, I guess.
So Kyle, you're synthesizing CBLA right now, is that correct?
No, we're synthesizing CBN, CBC, THCV, CBDQ, and CBG.
Okay. So like the CBDQ, is that found naturally in the plant?
So CBDQ can be found naturally in the plant after oxidation of the flowers.
Okay.
It's an oxidative byproduct of CBD. So it is found naturally occurring, but what you won't find in the plant is a CBDA or CBDQ synthase, for example. You're not going to find that in the same way you don't find a CBN synthase, because you have those are formed by the oxidative breakdown from sun exposure, heat exposure, etc. And so that one is right on the line of a synthetic cannabinoid that's not synthesized by the plant, but it is found in the plant.
Yeah, and I think, looking at kind of CBD as a guidepost for how they're going to regulate it is probably what I would do. There's 100 known cannabinoids, so you can make the argument they're naturally occurring. I think, not a regulator here, but I think broadly speaking, if you're consuming the product in a similar form to what has naturally been consumed, it's okay. But once you're kind of processing it to get to a non-natural potency, so like CBD, it starts to become a little bit outside of that. Not necessarily that you need to file a drug application, but just that you need to kind of prove toxicity more. But then if a pharma company does find that CBQ has some specific indicator and they prove that, that's where like GW Pharmaceuticals was able to get CBD patented as a drug. And so I think looking how CBD's been regulated is some guidepost. and then looking at other naturally derived ingredients like, say, vitamin E. If you get it from, a plant and you purify it and then put it in a vitamin, that's fine as long as you're kind of making sure you're talking about the toxicity data of that product, and then it's kind of a dietary ingredient or a food and not necessarily a drug. So, but I consult attorneys.
Cool. Celeste, we have time for questions from the crowd. Okay, we get one question, front row.
Thanks. There's been talk about creating a different structure for synthesized cannabinoids through the NCIA. I know they had some discussions about that. Given the harm and the stigmatization, the renewed stigmatization that it's giving to the opponents of cannabis, and this, harm to children, all these things that can happen. What do you think the possibility of that happening, having an entirely different category for synthesized cannabinoids, to take it off the back of the whole plant people?
So are you saying that the synthesized cannabinoids will be categorized and sold differently?
Yes.
So when I think about that, I think about, we have some examples of prescription medications that are now available over the counter. So I remember a time when Pepcid was only available by prescription, and Zyrtec, I think, and Allegra, some allergy medications, but now you can get them over the counter. So, what happened there? Well, first they had a medical indication, went through a lot of testing, and then they were available under physician supervision. Eventually, they were found to be extremely safe, and now they're available over the counter to the general public. I would see a pathway more like that, rather than just saying, okay, these are synthetics and they're available now, just be a little more careful. I think that's not a usual pathway, whereas, kind of making a synthetic, sending it down the pharmaceutical pathway, and then maybe someday it can come out to, general use, is an existing pathway.
And I think kind of to add, my mental hierarchy is it psychoactive, yes or no? That's probably the first question. If it's yes, I think you're just going to have to deal with the DEA, and they're going to catch up. That's my opinion. If it's not psychoactive, then I think you're kind of in the, is it toxic? And that's kind of, now you're in the FDA's realm. And once you're there, I think you can end up in kind of honestly, a vitamin C. You can get vitamin C from orange juice or a lemon, or they synthesize it and they put it in a tablet and you take it, and it's the exact same vitamin C. One is synthesized, one came from the plant. Chemically, they're identical, and they're both proven safe. So I almost see it going into that kind of vitamin route if it's not psychoactive and it's not toxic. That's my thought.
Yeah, and to touch on what Jake just said, sorry, Liz.
No, you're fine.
I would say that I don't think you need to categorize the cannabinoids that are created synthetically themselves as a synthetic category. What I think the future holds for these synthesized cannabinoids is going to be a new form of licensure for the companies that want to produce naturally occurring cannabinoids synthetically, to ensure that they are doing it correctly and it is up to spec, because you run into some issues. I know a lot of people that make bulk THC-free distillate by blending different minor cannabinoids together with CBD isolate. And so if you end up with a product like that, you get a confusing, where you have hemp-derived CBD, but then you have synthetically made but hemp-derived CBN that you're mixing in together, and it just gets really convoluted. So I think a better approach to that would be to ensure that the manufacturers that are making it are licensed to make those synthetic cannabinoids in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah, it's just scary to see some of these state regulators looking at, the D8 stuff that's out there, and then saying, the opponent saying, well, this is what CBD wanted in the first place, was to get people high that way. So they're, shutting this down, and it's causing all kinds of confusion. And it'd be nice if everybody caught up and just understood the science of it, but usually the state politicians don't. So it's hard to watch it turn some of the CBD wellness products, giving it a bad name, in their eyes.
Well, and I think, I would absolutely agree that it's the difference between whether it's psychoactive, not psychoactive, and toxic, right? The DEA is very clear that THC, synthetically derived THC, is a Schedule I drug. What they haven't done is define synthetically derived. So once they define that, it could shut down anybody in a not legal market to creating that product.
Is that
You're not allowed to ask questions, sorry.
Yeah. Is that definition for all Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10 THC, not just specific to Delta 9?
Correct.
However, naturally derived. So the current Delta 8 THC is, according to them, Schedule 1 substance, according to the DEA?
I would argue yes.
If it is just extracted out of hemp as Delta 8, that's a really tricky question, right? But it's very clear that they say synthetically derived THC is a Schedule I drug.
And then the one thing I would add to that is then you end up in a situation where you have contradictory legislation that's currently in place, where if it's derived from hemp and it has less than 0.3% Delta 9, it's totally legal. But the DEA is, on the other hand, saying that if it's a synthetic THC, it's illegal, and you end up in a complete gray area, which is what I think people really refer to Delta 8 as. And that's why you have contradictory legislation kind of telling you both things.
If you read the DEA's Orange Book summary, it's pretty clear that they consider Delta 8 THC to be illegal. They have a category called tetrahydrocannabinoids, and it says Delta 9 THC or any isomer, salt, derivative, etc. So it doesn't specify synthetically derived or not. It doesn't matter. So in my opinion, when you look at what the DEA thinks, I would think that it's clearly illegal, Delta 8.
Yeah, and like the similar World Health Organization has a long list of THC and THC isomers, and all of them are on the list, and those have been there for a long time, and FDA and DEA stuff back in 2005. So it's very clear that they consider them analogs or isomers. And yeah, I mean, it's, if you want to argue the gray area between the Farm Bill and the DEA and contradict, like, more power to you. But my stance and our company's stance is we're not messing with the DEA. Like, they're scarier than everyone else. So.
Were there any other questions from the crowd? Cool. I think we're going to wrap this up. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to our wonderful speakers.
Thank you.
I don't like being on a panel with you guys. You guys are too smart.